and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the City of Hampton. And today we're going to talk about one of our favorite topics, which is Fort Monroe, the place we all love, and specifically the National Park Service involvement there. And our guest is the new Superintendent, Terry E. Brown. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's great. Now, I'm calling you new, but you've been here for a few months now, right?
2 months, exactly.
Is that all? Oh,
yes.
You are new. Okay. Let's talk about you first, and then we'll get to Fort Monroe.
Sure.
Obviously, this isn't your first park. You've been in the service for a while.
Yes.
Tell me why you wanted to get with the National Park Service and what some of the things you've done there.
Yeah. It really dates back to, my early childhood in Columbus, Georgia. My father was a military man, and at the age of 6, he was deployed to Germany. And from the age of 6 to 17, I lived in Europe.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. I lived in Europe.
That's a long time. Most people only stay a few
time.
years and then come back.
Absolutely. I lived in Germany, Stuttgart, Ramstein, Holland. And once I left there, I went to a historically black college in Louisiana.
What a culture change.
Absolutely. I'm
what
a Gremlin
cool idea,
Knight.
though. Yeah.
So it was interesting. As I'm talking to you now, I could see my mother in the kitchen putting together baskets of sandwiches and sweet potato pie and all those great things. And every weekend we would go out to various places. I mean, we went everywhere. We went down the Rhine River, we went to castles and things like that. So by the time I got to college and the Park Service was recruiting, I was absolutely tuned into what they were saying.
It's been a big part of your life, but interestingly, not our U.S. parks.
That's right, that's right.
A whole different park system.
Right, and I had a great appreciation for history through my parents. So when the Park Service offered the opportunity to work for them, my very first experience was in northern Pennsylvania, where they call the Upper Delaware Scenic and Recreational Area. And the first 2 weeks I was hiking, canoeing, fishing, camping, and then 2 weeks later they gave me a paycheck.
Isn't that
And I said, are you kidding me?
great?
I'm doing this the rest of my life.
And so that was both historical and scenic, right?
Yes,
that park. And that's
right.
Fort Monroe has both of those aspects, and that's how I think we were able to help attract the Park Service, entice them.
Yes, yes. I give a lot of credit to this community in recognizing that Fort Monroe has such rich history. That doesn't happen every day, that a community recognizes that. And I tip my hat to them because Fort Monroe, if you just think about this, 10,000 years before the Europeans even stepped foot on this ground, American Indians were here. That alone should just set it as a special place by itself. We now know that the first arrival of Africans landed at Fort Monroe. The contraband story, John Smith. I mean, it's just an amazing place. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, and that's just taking us up to like
that's
the 1600s.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited about being here. I wanted to be here.
We were too, and I'm going to do a little shout out. It was a huge campaign on behalf of the city, and but specifically then Mayor Molly Ward really did the lobbying and the historical education and the connections in the state, in the federal government. I mean, I can't tell you how many times she drove to Washington to meet with people.
Yeah, she's a wonderful
really
person. Really
mobilized the community, and certainly there were grassroots efforts too.
Sure.
The Citizens for Fort Monroe. There was a lot of it, but pulling that together and leading the charge.
I agree.
It was
and I've had the opportunity to meet all those folks. They're wonderful.
Oh yeah, they're your biggest fan club.
They're my biggest fan club.
Before you got here, they were your fan club.
Yeah, they were out at the street with the pom-poms, and I loved it. So, but the hard work begins now because really we have to look at that space and we have to use it the right way.
And I'm going to just ask, I think a number of us who were involved in that effort are sort of going, okay, where are you?
Yeah.
And I'm very well versed on the city's budget constraints, but I forget the federal government has the same constraints. And so when a new monument or park or whatever you want to call it is added, that budget's probably not growing, or at least not at the pace it needs to. So how do you go about getting us more?
That's a really, really good question. Aside from having a cup in my hand and asking for help, we have internal structures. When the president declared this a monument, it doesn't happen quickly where funding is coming through the door.
Okay, it's the federal government. Nothing happens quickly.
Well, nothing happens quickly, but what we always have to keep in mind is that the military was there from 1819 to 2011.
2011.
That's almost 197 years. That's a long time. And, you know, that means the fort closed 5 years ago. So the transition from a military fort to a national monument is, I mean, it's a lot to ask for a transition to occur in 5 years. But we're actually on track to really start doing some really significant things. I just got approval to increase my staffing levels, so
I'd like to announce that. That's so exciting.
Really great.
We are happy.
Yeah, I think
there's been just the superintendent and one other person.
I have one employee, and he's an amazing person. He does a lot of great stuff for me. But in the upcoming months and years, you should see more rangers with these kind of hats walking around and really educating people about the resources. You know, the greatest thing about the National Park Service being in your backyard, we really don't care if you have $10 million in your bank account or 10 cents. When you walk through the gate, it's for the enjoyment of everyone. That's the reason why I love the agency, and we want everyone to experience Fort Monroe. Just imagine this. I did this the other day. I drove through the gates, and I came across the Dead Rise restaurant. Have you ever eaten there?
Oh, yes, especially at sunset.
Oh, my goodness. Have you ever had the shrimp burrito?
No.
Awesome. Awesome. You have to go there. Then I drove around to the seawall, and I saw people jogging and walking and sitting and watching the ships go by. I was like, that's pretty cool. Then I took a little left turn, and there was the sandy beaches. People were enjoying the beaches. Then you go further down, and you see the Paradise Ocean Club, and that is fantastic. I took my shoes off and ran out into the water.
That's like being on a Caribbean island somewhere,
Exactly.
really, with the atmosphere they've created.
And it's awesome. And you have the traveling, the RV Colony Park, and the people down there are wonderful. And I have a lot of great plans that I want to help them out with. I think we're going to have a great place for people to visit in the near future. I think if the community gives me about 1 year, and I know you've been waiting 5, but you give me 1 year, we should have a very, very refined and refreshed looking Fort Monroe because...
Well, and how do you go about making those choices? Because right now, the great thing about Fort Monroe, the asset is there's a million stories to tell.
Yes.
And that's also the challenge. Like, which stories do you tell? How do you decide which programs you do first?
It's very challenging. And I don't have a good answer for that. All I know is I treat them all like my kids. I love them all, and they'll get treated equally when I get around to each one of them. And they're challenging stories. Think about this. You have, you know, Jefferson Davis. And you have the first arrival. You have the contraband. You have John Smith. You have the natural resources. All of that. How do you tell that?
Right.
But I also think that makes it unique because it caters to everyone.
Yeah, there are a lot of national parks where, and I used to camp and do, and you're there for the nature, and you're hiking in the woods, and that's why you go. And Fort Monroe, though, you get the history, and hopefully someday the northern beach, which will be a little more, you know, a little less processed, you know, a little more natural. Like some of the others.
Well, I have plans for North Beach. I'm happy to say that the Army...
North Beach, see, the old timers, we call it Dog Beach.
Oh, is that right?
Because that's where dogs were allowed and civilians when it was the military base. Yes, visitors like me were allowed on Dog Beach.
Oh,
that's
very interesting.
Nice.
Okay.
But what is the plan? I know the holdup, but people ask me all the time, so I'm going to make you answer.
Well, I'm happy to say that the Army and the National Park Service has agreed to facilitate a transfer. So the transfer from the Army to the National Park Service should take place in the next few months. That is really good news.
That is a big step.
That's a big step.
That's huge.
And now
because you guys weren't ready to accept it because it wasn't cleaned up to your standards.
Exactly. But we've reached an agreement, and I think in the next year or two, I'll be able to get a good assessment of what's going on there and make a determination as to what I want to do with it. But I won't make any decisions without the community chiming in. I think it's important that folks tell me what they would like to do with that space. And I'll go from there.
You know, that honestly is part of what's taken so long. I know when Kirsten came in, there was this whole public input process that the National Park has, and it was online, and it was in meetings.
Yes.
But people need to remember that the opportunity to give input also makes the process go slowly. You could come in and make those decisions much quicker, but they might not be the decisions we want. So we're part of the delay.
I'm glad you appreciate that part. Yes, I agree. But I'm excited about what people will be able to do with Fort Monroe in the near future. We have a signage study that's being done now. We're going to redo the signs at Fort Monroe in the next year or two. And I think you will see new ways of getting around. We want to guide people to the Casemate Museum. We want people to go down and sit in the grass. And,
well, the Army was not in the business of marketing its assets. It was in the business of protecting our country. And that was a lovely sideline that they did, you know, to operate that museum and preserve those artifacts. But it's not their mission. It is your mission.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I think once we put the signs up, I think the last numbers I looked at was around 100,000 people who trafficked Fort Monroe last year. But once we get the signs up and it starts to feel and smell and touch like a national park, that number is going to go up big time. I don't want people going to Virginia Beach. I want them to stop at Fort Monroe and see all the assets we have there.
I love those beaches. Now, right now, though, the beaches are the city operated, which means we clean it up and we pay the lifeguards, basically. But the city beach, you've got the private beach. And that touches one of the other things that's really unique about Fort Monroe, which is that property has a lot of bosses. The state owns a piece. You guys own a piece. The Army still owns a piece that they're going to transfer you to. And it's all within the city of Hampton. So is that a challenge? Does that make it, you know, a little more difficult to make decisions and do things and move forward?
It's a challenge. I won't sit on this program and tell you it's not. But here's where I think we're going to get around that. From day one, I met with the mayor of this city, wonderful person. I met with the superintendent of schools, wonderful person. I met with several community people and several people within the city government. They're all eager to work with me. That's huge. That doesn't always happen. And I think what we're doing behind the scenes to really make Fort Monroe a special place, I think in another year or two, we're going to resolve all those kind of issues and those kind of headaches. And really the public won't see those kind of frustrations. They'll just be able to enjoy the space.
Yeah, and they don't know whose space they're in. Honestly, they don't know that that beach the city pays for the lifeguards and the other beach, you know, something else happens, or that the gazebo is controlled by the Fort Monroe Authority. They think of it as one entity because it's always been the Army's entity. And it should feel seamless. You shouldn't feel like, oh, this doesn't fit in with the national park because it's part of the state. It should feel like there's a cohesive...
I agree. Now, one of my charges is to develop what they call a superintendent's compendium. And that's
that sounds bureaucratic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I can't wait to read that.
So right now, folks are just walking around aimlessly using the park in whatever fashion, but we're charged with creating rules. It's a compilation of rules, policy, regulations, and I'm going to sign that on October 1st. And it really will be an opportunity for people to understand how to use the park. Because we're in the business of preservation. We want this place to last for hundreds of years. So once that's out, I'll make it public, and the folks will be able to enjoy the park.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to do the big picture. So you're here now. Maybe you'll finish your career here. Maybe you won't. What will Fort Monroe National Monument look like in 25 or 30 years?
Well, I think that if you were to arrive at Fort Monroe 20 years down the road, the grass is going to be different. I'm going to change that grass. I want people to sit in the grass and have picnics. I want people to look up in the stars at night and look up in the sky and see all the stars. It's interesting. When I was in the Park Service in my early years, I got a chance to stop at a mountain in Montana. And I sat on this ridge for about 2 hours, and I didn't hear a plane, train, or automobile. And I want young people to experience that opportunity. Just imagine, when the last time you sat somewhere and you didn't hear a train or automobile?
You know,
think about
this is a very urban area, too. And people here, some of them can't afford to travel a whole lot. And you are an oasis in the middle of this very urban place.
Absolutely.
No, there are kids who've never been somewhere where there wasn't a street light that blocked out the view at night.
I don't know how many people in this region ever seen a superintendent for the National Park Service who happens to be African American. I take the position very seriously. I think young folks can look at this and see something else to attain to, you know. I think the National Park Service, when it was created in 1916, had a unique perspective on the country. Think about this. We have 413 units in the National Park Service. I think President Obama just signed one 2 days ago or something like that.
He's going out with a bang.
He's going out with a bang. But the next 100 years, because we just celebrated our 100th year
I know, that's
on
pretty
August
exciting,
25th.
actually.
But the next 100 years, we're looking at evolving. We know that over half of the newborns in this country are from racially diverse cultures. We know that. We know that over 80% of the population lives in urban areas. We know that. We know that people of color are the majority in California, New Mexico, Hawaii, you name it. So with that in mind, we have to focus on some of these folks. We have to get them to visit national parks. And one of my charges in 20 or 30 years is to have people of color visiting national parks in greater numbers.
So right now you're saying they don't. I hadn't thought about that.
No, they do not visit national parks in large numbers. It's not that we don't visit, but I like to see the number increase. When I was in the early years of my Park Service experience and visiting other parks, I had no idea that my story was relevant.
Right.
I really didn't know. But African Americans have fought in every war in this continent. We've had major roles in building this country. We built Fort Monroe.
You built Fort Monroe, that's right.
And think about this. The first arrival occurred at Fort Monroe. You push that arc 190-some years later, the first African-American president signs his very first park into legislation. He makes that Fort Monroe.
Right. And then in between, you have the contraband decision where freedom began.
Right.
Not 100%, but it was probably the single biggest step toward the Emancipation Proclamation.
And now 5 years later, I'm sitting in this chair. America's a great place. How about that?
That's awesome. All right, we have to close on that.
No.
I can't top that. That is beautiful.
It's such a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and sharing your vision with us.
Thank you.
We're going to hold you to it.
Yes, come visit. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you for watching.